A biker strutted into Buckingham Palace grounds, swinging a heavy metal chain, convinced no one could stop him. He taunted the royal guard, daring him to react. But the moment he struck, everything changed in an instant. Here's what happened. But before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Also, make sure to check out our second channel, Guard Patrol, linked in the pinned comments, because we upload daily at the same time on both channels. So, subscribe to both and never miss a powerful story. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the grounds of Buckingham Palace as Marcus Cole navigated his custom Harley through the throng of tourists. The deep rumble of the engine caused heads to turn, conversations to pause, and parents to instinctively draw their children closer. Cole carried himself with the easy confidence of someone used to commanding respect through fear. His leather vest bore the weathered patches of his charter, each one a testament to years spent building a reputation that made even hardened criminals think twice. The slicked-back hair and trimmed beard gave him an almost sophisticated appearance, but his eyes held something darker. The cold calculation of a predator sizing up potential prey. "Quite a show they put on here," he remarked to no one in particular, killing the engine and dismounting with fluid grace. His boots connected with the pavement in a way that suggested he was more used to dealing out trouble than avoiding it. All these people lined up to watch some guy stand still. Now that's what I call entertainment. The nearby tourists created subtle distance between themselves and Cole, responding to some primitive instinct that recognized danger. Even the street vendors, usually quick to approach anyone who looked like they could afford their wares, found urgent business elsewhere. Cole's attention fixed on the royal guard standing at attention nearby, his gaze lingering on the ceremonial rifle and pristine uniform. A slight smirk played across his face as he adjusted the heavy chain looped through his belt. Not the decorative kind tourists bought in souvenir shops, but the kind that had left its mark in more than one back-alley dispute. "You folks want to see a real show?" he called out, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from years of making people regret defiance. "Let's find out what happens when all this ceremony meets some street reality." The atmosphere shifted palpably as Cole began moving toward the guard. His every step radiated the controlled menace of someone who had spent a lifetime perfecting the art of intimidation. The chain at his hip clinked with each movement, a quiet counterpoint to the whispered warnings of tourists hurrying their families away from what they sensed was coming. The guard remained motionless at his post, but there was something in his bearing, a subtle tension, visible only to those who knew what to look for, that suggested this encounter might not play out the way Cole expected. The ceremonial rifle and bearskin cap seemed to amuse Cole, his smirk deepening as he positioned himself directly in front of the guard. "Well, look at this," he drawled, loud enough for the growing circle of onlookers to hear. "All dressed up like it's some kind of costume party." He circled the guard slowly, boots scraping against the stones with calculated menace. "Where I come from, we measure a man by what he can do, not how pretty he looks, standing still." A young mother hurried past, pulling her children close, as Cole's presence seemed to darken the very air around them. The chain at his hip caught the sunlight, its metal links speaking of violence barely contained. "You know what we do to men who think uniforms make them special?" Cole's voice dropped lower, taking on the edge that had made countless rivals back down in territory disputes. "In my charter, respect isn't given, it's taken. And all this—" He gestured at the palace walls, the ceremonial post, the pristine uniform. "This is just asking to be taken down a notch." The guard maintained his forward gaze, disciplined and unwavering. But there was something in his posture, a subtle readiness that spoke of years of real combat experience, of battles fought far from these ceremonial grounds. "Nothing to say," Cole taunted, moving closer until his breath could fog the guard's brass buttons. "That's all right. In my experience, the quiet ones break the hardest." His hand brushed the chain at his hip, an unconscious gesture that had signaled the start of many violent encounters. Two elderly men had paused near a palace gate, their bearing suggesting military background. They watched the scene unfold, with the calm assessment of men who had seen similar situations escalate before. "Let me tell you how this works," Cole continued, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to being the most dangerous person in any room. "In my world, there's no hiding behind tradition or protocol. There's just power. Who has it, and who's pretending?" He reached out, fingers hovering near the guard's ceremonial rifle. "And right now, friend, you're doing an awful lot of pretending." The crowd had grown larger now, drawn by the tension crackling in the air. Some filmed with their phones, while others stood in uneasy silence, recognizing the calculated aggression in Cole's every movement. "See, that's the difference between your world and mine." Cole's hand moved to his vest, adjusting it with practiced casualness that barely concealed its threatening intent. "You stand here playing soldier, following rules made by people who've never had to fight for respect, while men like me?" His smile showed teeth that had seen their share of violence. "We make our own rules." The guard's eyes remained fixed forward, but those who looked closely might have noticed his fingers adjust ever so slightly on his rifle, not in fear, but in the kind of readiness that came from real battlefield experience. "Still nothing?" Cole's voice took on a harder edge, frustration beginning to seep through his controlled demeanor. "That's all right. We're just getting started, and trust me," he patted the chain at his hip, the metal links singing their quiet song of impending violence. "By the time we're done, you'll have plenty to say." "And you know what really gets me?" Cole's voice took on a new edge as he paced before the guard, each step matching the rhythmic clink of his chain. "It's not just the uniform, or this whole ceremonial circus. It's how you people think standing still makes you strong." The sun had shifted position, casting Cole's shadow across the guard's polished boots. His slicked-back hair caught the light as he moved, giving him an almost theatrical presence that commanded attention from the growing crowd. "In my charter, we have a saying," he continued, rolling his shoulders with the fluid menace of a fighter preparing to strike. "Respect isn't earned by following orders. It's taken by those strong enough to make their own rules." His hand rested on the chain again, fingers wrapping around the cold metal with familiar intimacy. The two military veterans had drawn closer, their weathered faces showing the calm recognition of men who understood the difference between theatrical threats and real danger. One touched his service medals unconsciously, eyes never leaving the scene unfolding before them. "See, I've dealt with authority types before," Cole's voice carried across the courtyard, each word dripping with barely contained aggression. "Police, rival charters, wannabe tough guys who think a badge or a uniform makes them untouchable." He leaned in closer to the guard, close enough that the leather of his vest creaked audibly. "But they all learn the same lesson in the end." The guard's posture remained perfect, but there was a new tension in the air. Not fear, but the coiled readiness of a trained warrior assessing a genuine threat. His ceremonial rifle, though held in precise parade position, somehow seemed less ceremonial in his practiced grip. "Your problem," Cole continued, beginning another circle around the guard, "is that you've forgotten what real power looks like, standing here day after day, playing statue for the tourists." He paused directly behind the guard, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "It's made you soft." A young couple quickly guided their children away from the scene, responding to the primitive instinct that recognized escalating danger. Even the most eager photographers had lowered their cameras, sensing that this was no longer about capturing a tourist moment. "In my world," Cole's voice hardened as he completed his circuit, "we test our strength every day, not by standing still, not by following orders, but by taking what we want." His fingers traced the length of his chain, the metal links catching the sunlight like teeth. "And right now, what I want is to see what happens when all this discipline meets real street justice." The veterans exchanged glances, years of military experience telling them this was moving beyond mere provocation. The older one shifted his weight slightly, ready to intervene if necessary, though his face showed the grim understanding that some lessons could only be learned the hard way. Still nothing to say. Cole's control began to slip, frustration bleeding into his carefully cultivated menace. No response at all? He moved closer, invading the guard's space with deliberate aggression. Maybe we need to make this more interesting. Maybe it's time to show everyone here what happens when ceremony meets reality. The chain clinked ominously as Cole's hand wrapped fully around it, his knuckles whitening with tension. The late afternoon sun cast harsh shadows across his face, deepening the lines of aggression that years of violence had etched there. "Last chance, soldier boy," he announced, his voice carrying the finality of someone who had moved beyond threats to action. "Show me something real. Show me you're more than just a uniform and some memorized rules." His free hand gestured expansively at the crowd. "Give all these people watching something worth seeing, because if you don't—" The chain began to slide from his belt, the sound of metal on leather carrying clearly in the tense silence that had fallen over the courtyard. The guard's shadow stretched long across the stones, intersecting with Cole's in a dark prediction of what was to come. "If you don't," Cole's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper, "I'm going to have to teach everyone here a lesson about real power, about what happens when your precious tradition meets someone who isn't playing by your rules." The guard remained motionless, but those who knew what to look for might have noticed the subtle shift in his stance. Not fear, not uncertainty, but the kind of readiness that came from years of real combat experience. The kind of readiness that said this confrontation was about to move far beyond what the ignorant biker had planned. "Time's up," Cole announced, fully uncoiling the chain from his belt. The metal links sang through the air as he let them dangle, each swing marking a silent countdown. "Let's see how well all that training serves you when faced with some street reality." His practiced fingers worked the chain with familiar ease, letting it flow between his hands like liquid metal. The crowd had retreated further, creating an arena of empty space around the unfolding confrontation. Even the bravest onlookers sensed that the situation had moved beyond entertainment into something far more dangerous. "You know what this is?" Cole held up the chain, letting sunlight glint off its weathered links. "This isn't just metal. This is the currency of respect where I come from. Each link has a story. Each scratch marks someone who thought they were untouchable." His eyes narrowed as he focused on the guard. "Just like you do now." The veterans had moved closer to the palace gates, their postures reflecting years of combat readiness. They recognized the signs. The subtle shift in Cole's breathing, the way his weight settled into a fighter's stance, the predatory focus that preceded violence. "In my charter," Cole continued, beginning to swing the chain in a lazy arc by his side, "we have a ritual for dealing with men who think they're above the rest of us. Men who hide behind uniforms and tradition." The chain's whisper through the air grew louder, more insistent. "We strip away their pretenses, their rules, their precious dignity, show them what real power feels like." The guard's immobility seemed to infuriate Cole further. Each moment of disciplined silence feeding his growing rage, the controlled menace in his bearing began to crack, revealing something darker beneath. "Nothing to say. Not even now." The chain's arc widened as Cole's control slipped further. "That's all right. Actions speak louder than words anyway." He adjusted his grip, years of street fights and violent encounters guiding his movements. "And I'm about to make a statement everyone here will remember." The afternoon sun caught the chain's movement, casting twisted shadows that danced across the courtyard stones. Cole's slicked back hair had begun to loosen, small strands falling across his face as his composure deteriorated. "Last warning, soldier boy," he snarled, the chain now cutting figure eights through the air. "Show me something real. Show me there's actually a man under all that ceremony." His voice dropped to a dangerous growl. "Or I'm going to show everyone here what happens when your world collides with mine." The guard remained stationary, but there was a new tension in his bearing. Not fear, but the coiled readiness of a predator preparing to strike. His ceremonial rifle, though still held in perfect parade position, somehow seemed more weapon than prop in his practiced grip. "Have it your way, then," Cole's voice carried a note of finality as he settled into his stance. The chain whirled faster, its whistle through the air becoming a banshee scream of impending violence. Time to learn what real power looks like. The crowd's collective intake of breath was audible as Cole drew back his arm, the chain gathering momentum like a metal serpent preparing to strike. His face had transformed into a mask of pure aggression, all pretense of control abandoned. "Welcome to my world," he growled, muscles tensing for the strike. The chain arced upward, its links catching the sunlight one final time before beginning their deadly descent toward the guard's head. In that moment, suspended between threat and action, between discipline and violence, between ceremony and brutal reality, time seemed to stop. But in that frozen instant, those watching closely might have noticed something in the guard's bearing change. Not fear, not uncertainty, but the subtle shift of a trained warrior moving from ceremonial duty to combat readiness. Whatever happened next, it was clear this encounter wasn't going to end the way Cole expected. The chain sliced through the air with lethal intent, its metal links howling a song of violence as they descended toward the guard's head. Cole's face twisted into a savage grin, anticipating the moment of impact, the shattering of ceremony beneath raw force. But the strike never landed. In a motion too swift for most observers to follow, the guard's white-gloved hand shot up and caught the chain mid-swing. The metal links went suddenly silent, their deadly momentum arrested by a grip forged through years of combat training. For a split second, everything stood still. Cole's expression frozen between triumph and disbelief, the crowd's collective gasp hanging in the air, the chain trembling between striker and target. Then reality reasserted itself with explosive force. The guard's fingers closed around the chain like a steel trap, and with one fluid motion he yanked hard. Cole, still gripping the other end, stumbled forward, his carefully cultivated balance shattered. The guard pivoted smoothly, his ceremonial stance transforming into combat readiness with practiced ease. Before Cole could recover, the guard stepped inside his guard, using the chain's momentum against its wielder. In one devastating movement, he wrapped the excess links around Cole's extended arm, turning the biker's own weapon into a restraint. "What the?" Cole's protest cut off in a grunt of pain as the guard applied precise pressure, forcing him to his knees. The chain that had been meant to demonstrate power now bound its master, each link a cold reminder of miscalculation. The guard's movements were economical, practiced, the fluid efficiency of someone who had trained for real combat, not street brawls. He maintained control of Cole with one hand, while keeping his ceremonial rifle perfectly positioned with the other, never fully breaking protocol, even as he neutralized the threat. Cole tried to resist, attempting to surge upward, but the guard's grip was immovable. Each struggle only tightened the chain's embrace, turning his own weapon against him with mathematical precision. His slicked-back hair had come completely undone now, falling across his face as he grunted with futile effort. "Stay down," the guard commanded, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had given orders in far more dangerous situations. The pressure he applied was calculated, enough to control, not to damage, speaking of professional training rather than street fighting. The veterans watching nodded in approval, recognizing the technical precision of the guard's response. This wasn't the wild violence of back-alley brawls that Cole knew. This was the refined efficiency of military combat training, where every movement served a purpose. "The rifle's ceremonial," the guard continued, his voice level, despite Cole's continued struggles. "The training isn't." He adjusted his grip slightly, causing Cole to inhale sharply as the chain tightened. 8 years special forces before this post. Would you like a demonstration of what that means? Cole's only response was a muffled curse as he made one final attempt to break free. The guard ended that notion with a subtle shift of pressure that brought tears to the biker's eyes, his charter bravado crumbling beneath professional efficiency. The crowd watched in stunned silence. "Ceremonial duties," the guard's voice remained measured despite Cole's continued resistance, "do not equal ceremonial capabilities." His grip remained precise, professional. The practiced control of someone who had managed far more dangerous situations than an overconfident biker. Every slight movement of his hands spoke of years spent mastering the art of combat, where efficiency meant survival and control meant victory. "You feel that pressure?" he continued, making a microscopic adjustment that caused Cole to inhale sharply. "That's not street fighting. That's not charter rules. That's tactical joint manipulation, something we perfect in special forces training." The guard's words carried the weight of real battlefield experience, each syllable as measured as his grip. Two police officers had appeared at the edge of the crowd, moving forward with practiced urgency. But there was no rush in their approach. The situation was clearly under control, the threat contained with military precision. They recognized the guard's professional handling of the situation, their own training telling them to approach steadily but cautiously. "The uniform you mocked," the guard continued, adjusting his hold as Cole made one final futile attempt to rise, "is worn by active duty soldiers, men who've served in combat zones you couldn't find on a map." His words carried no heat, no anger, just the cold authority of absolute control. "The discipline you mistook for weakness. That's what's keeping you conscious right now. 3 degrees more pressure and you'd be taking a nap. 2 inches shift to the left and you'd be screaming. The fact that you're experiencing neither is not mercy. It's control." The chain clinked softly as Cole finally went still, reality setting in as his own weapon held him firmly in place. His carefully cultivated image of power had crumbled, replaced by the harsh truth of genuine military efficiency. The metal links that had been meant to demonstrate his strength now served only to highlight the difference between street-learned intimidation and professional combat training. You see, the thing about real combat experience, the guard's voice remained conversational even as his grip maintained perfect control, is that it teaches you the difference between looking dangerous and being dangerous. Your chain, your vest, your attitude, that's all theatre. What I'm demonstrating now, this is capability. "When you're ready," the guard addressed the approaching officers, "this gentleman was kind enough to demonstrate why we maintain a zero-tolerance policy for threats against the Queen's Guard." His tone could have been discussing the weather, even as he maintained perfect control of both Cole and his ceremonial rifle. Though I must admit, using his own chain to illustrate the point was a particularly fitting touch. The police officers moved in smoothly, their handcuffs replacing the chain's restraint with practiced efficiency. Cole offered no resistance now. The fight had drained from him, replaced by the stunned realization of how completely he had miscalculated. His eyes held the look of someone whose entire worldview had been systematically dismantled in the space of minutes. "The chain is evidence," the guard informed them, his voice carrying the same parade ground precision it had maintained throughout the encounter. "Along with multiple witness statements regarding his intent to cause grievous bodily harm to a member of His Majesty's Armed Forces, I believe the CCTV footage will be particularly enlightening." As the officers began to lead Cole away, the guard's voice stopped them momentarily. "One final thing. He addressed Cole directly, his words carrying across the now silent courtyard. The next time you mistake ceremony for weakness, remember, tradition doesn't make us soft. It gives us standards to live up to, standards that include knowing exactly how much force to use, when to use it, and most importantly, when to show restraint. You're walking away from this encounter under your own power. Consider that a demonstration of all three. The police resumed their escort, leading a subdued Cole toward their waiting vehicle. His leather vest, which had seemed so impressive minutes before, now hung awkwardly, its patches and symbols stripped of their menace by swift, professional action. Each step away from the scene seemed to diminish him further, the swagger replaced by the uncertain gait of someone who had just learned a profound lesson about the difference between projecting power and possessing it. The vehicle's doors closed with a solid thunk, muffling Cole's last attempt at salvaging his dignity. His slicked back hair, now dishevelled and damp with exertion, was a far cry from the intimidating figure who had strutted onto palace grounds mere minutes ago. Through the tinted glass, his tough exterior had crumbled, replaced by the hollow look of someone who'd learned the hard way about misreading situations. A whisper of wind stirred the courtyard, carrying away the last echoes of conflict, rustling the leaves of ancient oaks that had witnessed centuries of similar lessons. The guard stood perfectly positioned at his post, ceremonial rifle aligned with parade ground precision, brass buttons catching the late afternoon sun. No trace of the recent altercation showed in his bearing, just the same unwavering dedication to duty that had been there all along. The precision of his stance spoke volumes about the kind of discipline that had allowed him to shift from ceremonial guard to combat professional and back again without missing a beat. The two veterans paused at the palace gates one final time, sharing a glance that spoke volumes. Their campaign medals glinted in the fading light, each one representing battles fought and lessons learned about the true nature of strength. They'd seen this before. The moment when someone mistook ceremony for weakness, protocol for vulnerability. Their knowing smiles carried decades of understanding about the difference between those who display power and those who truly wield it. In their eyes was the quiet recognition that some lessons could only be taught through action, and some truths could only be understood through experience. Before leaving, one veteran touched his medals again, a gesture of respect for a guard who had just demonstrated why these posts were manned not by ceremonial figures, but by warriors who chose to stand watch. As the crowd dispersed, parents could be heard explaining to their children in hushed tones about respect, about tradition, about the true meaning of strength. The lesson had been clear. Ceremony and capability were not mutually exclusive, and sometimes the most dangerous men were the ones disciplined enough to stand perfectly still. The late afternoon sun continued its arc across the London sky, business as usual for the grounds of Buckingham Palace. The guard's shadow stretched long across the ancient stones, a silent reminder that while traditions may seem ceremonial, the men who uphold them are anything but. The chain that had been meant as a weapon lay coiled in an evidence bag, its links no longer singing threats, but instead serving as a permanent reminder that true power often lies not in the ability to strike, but in the discipline to know when and how to respond. What would have been your reaction if you had witnessed this encounter firsthand? Would you have recognized the signs of impending danger? Or, like many others, assumed it was just another tourist testing the guard's patience? More importantly, what does this incident teach us about the nature of true strength? Is it found in the ability to provoke and intimidate, or in the discipline to maintain composure until action becomes necessary? If this story resonated with you, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories about the Royal Guards who stand as living symbols of tradition and capability. Don't forget to press the bell icon to ensure you never miss our latest uploads. Our recent videos are appearing on your screen right now. including encounters that remind us why these guards command respect through more than just ceremony. Each story offers a unique perspective on the men who guard not just buildings, but principles. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever witnessed a moment where someone mistook discipline for weakness? We'd love to hear your stories and perspectives. Until next time, remember, true power isn't in the threats you make, but in the strength you hold in reserve.